I was standing in my driveway when my daughter-in-law handed me a printed document and said, "Sign this. It gives my parents permission to build on your property." She didn't ask. She told me. She was holding a pen like a weapon. My son was standing behind her with his arms crossed. He didn't look at me. He hasn't looked at me in months. Not directly. Not in a way that means anything. I took the paper. I read it. I looked up at her and said, "Get off my land." She laughed. She actually laughed. And that laugh was the last sound she made before I started destroying everything she thought she had built. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story doesn't start in that driveway. It starts somewhere much darker. Somewhere that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. It starts 22 years ago. The day I married Evelyn. I need you to understand something about Evelyn before I tell you what happened at the wedding. Evelyn doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't scream. She doesn't throw things. She does something worse. She makes you feel like you deserve whatever she does to you. Every cruel word. Every cold silence. Every time she dismantles you in front of other people. She does it with such precision that you start to believe you brought it on yourself. That is her real talent. Not intelligence. Not beauty. The ability to make her victims think they are the problem. The wedding was at her parents' country club. 200 people. My family filled 3 tables in the back corner. Her family filled the rest of the room. My mother wore a navy dress she'd bought on clearance. My father wore his only suit. The one with the fraying collar. My sister Claire sat next to her husband Derek and tried to smile. I could see her flinch every time Derek moved his arm. I noticed. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself that a lot over the years. Evelyn's mother, Margaret, walked me through the venue 2 hours before the ceremony. She pointed at the flower arrangements and said, "I changed these. The ones you picked were cheap." She pointed at the menu and said, "I changed this too. Your family wouldn't know good food if it was on fire." Then she stopped walking. She turned to me. She said, "Let me explain something. My daughter is the most valuable thing in this family. When you marry her, you are not gaining a wife. You are being given a position, and positions can be taken away." I was 25 years old. I should have turned around and walked out. But I looked across the room and saw Evelyn in her dress, and I thought she was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. That was my mistake. I confused beauty for safety. The ceremony started 20 minutes late because Margaret decided the string quartet was playing too fast. She made them restart. 200 people watched a quartet replay the same song because one woman decided the tempo was wrong. Nobody said a word. That should have told me everything. During the vows, Evelyn had written her own. The officiant read them. They included a line about honoring not just our marriage, but the family that created it. She said family in a way that meant her family. My family was not mentioned, not once. When it was my turn to say my vows, I looked at Evelyn and I said what I'd written. Simple words. Honest words. About love and partnership and building something real. When I finished, Margaret leaned over to the woman next to her and said loud enough for my mother to hear, "How quaint!" My mother heard it. I saw her hear it. She looked down at her hands and didn't look up for the rest of the ceremony. At the reception, Margaret gave a speech. She stood at the podium with a glass of champagne and said, "When Evelyn first brought Marcus home, I wasn't sure. He didn't come from our world, but then I realized. That's exactly what we needed. Someone malleable. Someone grateful. Someone who understands that being chosen by this family is the greatest gift he'll ever receive." 200 people applauded. My father did not applaud. He sat with his hands in his lap and stared at the tablecloth. After the reception, my father shook my hand. He didn't hug me. He just shook my hand and said, "Make it work, son." That was the last piece of advice my father ever gave me. He died 8 months later. And I've spent 20 years wondering if he meant make the marriage work or make the survival work. The first year of marriage was a test, not a metaphor, a literal test. Evelyn would do things and watch how I reacted. She'd cancel plans I'd made with friends and see if I'd argue. I didn't. She'd rearrange my office and see if I'd notice. I noticed. I said nothing. She'd invite her mother over without telling me, and I'd come home to find Margaret sitting in my chair drinking my whiskey. I'd smile and pour her another glass. 3 months in, Evelyn sat me down and said, "We need to talk about your family." I said, "Okay." She said, "Your mother called me today. She wants to visit for Thanksgiving." I told her no. I said, "You told my mother no?" Evelyn said, "I told her that our Thanksgiving is reserved for my family, that this is the tradition I'm establishing, that she needs to respect that." I called my mother. She didn't answer. I called again. She answered on the 4th ring. Her voice was flat. She said, "Evelyn explained it. I understand. We'll do our own thing." My mother had been cooking Thanksgiving dinner for 30 years. She had a recipe for cornbread that my father said was the only reason he married her. And my wife told her she wasn't welcome, and my mother just accepted it. I didn't fight for my mother that day. I told myself it was easier. That was the first lie I told myself in a marriage built on lies. 6 months into the marriage, I found the first phone. It was a burner phone, hidden in the back of Evelyn's underwear drawer. I know it sounds cliché, but that's where it was. I turned it on. There were text messages between Evelyn and a number saved as M. The messages were not romantic. They were operational. M said, "Did he sign the life insurance update?" Evelyn said, "Not yet. He keeps putting it off." M said, "Use the guilt approach. Tell him it's about the baby we're planning. Men respond to responsibility." Evelyn said, "Already tried. He's stalling." M said, "Then escalate. Have your mother call his mother. Create friction. When he's distracted, he'll sign anything to keep the peace." I put the phone back. I closed the drawer. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt something break inside me. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a crack in a foundation that you can't see but you know is there. I didn't confront Evelyn. I wasn't ready. I was still the grateful man Margaret had described at the wedding. The malleable one. But I started making a list. A mental list. Every lie. Every manipulation. Every time Evelyn or Margaret moved a piece on the board. I memorized it all. I had nothing else to do. I had no friends left. Evelyn had made sure of that. She'd done it slowly. One canceled plan at a time. One late-night argument before a dinner that made me call and cancel. One comment about how my friends didn't understand our lifestyle. Within 2 years I had no one. Just Evelyn, just Margaret. Just the house that Evelyn's family had helped us buy, but that I was paying for with the salary from a job that Margaret had found for me at her friend's company. I was surrounded, and I knew it. Around this time, Claire started calling me more. My sister. She'd call late at night after Derek was asleep. Her voice was always low, always careful. She'd say things like, "Marcus, do you ever feel like you can't breathe?" And I'd say, "All the time, Claire." And she'd say, "Good, at least it's not just me." One night she called and she wasn't careful. She was crying. She said, "He pushed me down the stairs last night. I told the hospital I fell. They believed me because I've told that lie so many times the words come out smooth now." I said, "Claire, leave." She said, "Where would I go? Mom and Dad can't afford to help. You're trapped in your own prison. I have nowhere." I said, "Come to my house." She said, "Evelyn would never allow it." She was right, and we both knew it. And that knowledge sat between us like a third person on the phone line. My sister was being beaten, and she couldn't come to me because my wife would see it as weakness, as an invasion, as evidence that my family was broken and hers was not. Claire stopped calling after that. For 3 months, I heard nothing. Then, I got a call from my mother. She said Claire was in the hospital, hurt an arm, 2 cracked ribs. My mother said, "She fell again." The way my mother said again told me she knew. She knew, and she was choosing the lie. I drove to the hospital. Claire was in a bed with her eyes closed. Derek was in the chair next to her holding her hand. When he saw me, he smiled. He said, "She's clumsy. Always has been." I looked at Claire. Her eyes opened. She looked at me. And in that look was everything. The pain. The shame. The anger. Not at Derek. At me. For not coming sooner. For not fighting harder. I said nothing. I hugged her. He left. I went home and sat in my car in the driveway for 45 minutes. Evelyn watched me from the window. When I came inside, she said, "Where were you?" I said, "Visiting my sister." She said, "You should have told me. I don't like surprises." I said, "Neither do I, Evelyn." It was the first time I'd ever pushed back. Even slightly, even barely. She looked at me for a long time. Then she went upstairs. I heard her on the phone. I pressed my ear to the door. She was talking to Margaret. She said, "He's getting strange. He went to the hospital without telling me. He made a comment about surprises. I think he's cracking." Margaret said something I couldn't hear. Then Evelyn said, "No, not yet. We need him compliant until after the property transfer." Property transfer. I didn't know what that meant, but I filed it away, added it to the list. 2 years into the marriage, Evelyn got pregnant. She announced it at Margaret's Sunday dinner in front of 30 people. She said, "We're having a boy." I said, "How do you know it's a boy?" She said, "Because I decided." Everyone laughed. I didn't. His name was Jason, and from the moment Jason was born, Margaret took control. She was in the delivery room. I was in the waiting room. She chose the pediatrician. She chose the nanny. She chose the school he would eventually attend. Jason was 3 days old when Margaret said to me in the hallway of the hospital, "He'll go to Dalton, then Columbia, then law school. This child is the future of this family, and you will not get in the way of that." Jason was 3 days old, and his future was already written by a woman who wasn't his father. I watched Jason grow up in that environment, watched him become a product of Margaret's factory. He was polite, disciplined, cold in a way that children shouldn't be cold. By age 8, he could recite dinner party etiquette. By age 10, he could read a room and identify the most powerful person in it. By age 12, he had learned to dismiss people without them knowing they'd been dismissed. He learned all of this from Margaret, not from me. Because Margaret made sure I was barely present in Jason's life. She filled his schedule with activities she chose. She took him on trips I wasn't invited to. She created a bond with my son that had no room for a father. When Jason was 14, I tried to intervene. I told Evelyn I wanted to take Jason camping. Just the two of us. Evelyn said, "Jason has a tennis tournament that weekend." I said, "I'll move it, I'll talk to the coach." Evelyn said, "You will not disrupt his schedule for a camping trip. What would that even accomplish? You sitting by a fire trying to bond? You don't know how to bond with him." "Margaret does, let her do it." I went to Jason's room that night. He was doing homework. I said, "Hey buddy, would you want to go camping sometime?" He didn't look up from his book. He said, "Maybe, but Grandma says camping is a waste of educational time." He was 14, and he was quoting Margaret like scripture. I backed out of the room and closed the door, and I realized that I had lost my son. Not to death, not to distance, to a woman who had decided from the day he was born that he belonged to her. Now I need to tell you about the property, because that's what this whole story is really about. When my father died, he left me 40 acres of land in upstate New York. Rolling hills, a creek, a farmhouse that was falling apart, but had good bones. My father's family had owned that land for 4 generations. It was the one thing my family had, that Margaret's family couldn't buy. I never told Evelyn the full extent of what I owned. I told her about the land, but I downplayed it. I said it was 20 acres. I said the farmhouse was condemned. I made it sound worthless, because I knew if she understood its value, she would find a way to take it. But Margaret found out. I still don't know how. Maybe through the probate records. Maybe through a background check she ran when we first got married. Margaret runs background checks on everyone. She told me that once. Proudly. Like it was a personality trait. Margaret knew about the 40 acres. And she waited. She was patient. She spent years positioning pieces on the board. Getting Jason through school. Getting him to law school. And then Jason met Nadia. Nadia. My daughter-in-law. The woman standing in my driveway with a document demanding I let her parents build on my land. Nadia is what happens when you cross Evelyn with Margaret and add a 3rd generation of ambition. She's beautiful in a sharp way. Dark hair. Perfect posture. A smile that never reaches her eyes. She grew up in a family that was wealthy but not Margaret-level wealthy. Her parents Victor and Irina came to this country from Eastern Europe when Nadia was 4. They built a small business. They had money but they wanted more. And Nadia was their ticket to more. Jason met Nadia in law school. Margaret approved immediately. Not because she liked Nadia. Because she saw utility. Nadia was smart. Nadia was ruthless. Nadia would marry Jason and expand the family's reach. That's all Margaret ever saw in people. Reach, utility, leverage. The wedding was another performance. Another Margaret production. 250 people this time. Bigger than mine. Because everything with Margaret escalates. My family was given 4 tables this time. Still in the back. Still separated. My mother was 81 by then. She sat in a chair and watched the spectacle. Claire was there. She had finally left Derek 2 years earlier. She had a black eye covered with makeup that nobody mentioned. We sat next to each other and said nothing. What was there to say? At Jason and Nadia's wedding, Margaret gave another speech. She said, "This family grows stronger with every union. Every marriage is a brick in the wall we're building, and that wall will stand for generations." She looked directly at me when she said it. I knew what she meant. She was telling me that Jason and Nadia's marriage was the next phase. That the property I owned was now in play. After the reception, Nadia came up to me while Evelyn was talking to someone across the room. Nadia said, "Marcus, can I call you Marcus?" I said, "You just did." She smiled. She said, "Jason told me about the land upstate, the 40 acres. I looked at her. She said, "Don't worry, I think it's wonderful that you've kept it in the family. I just want you to know that when the time comes, I'll take good care of it." She squeezed my arm and walked away. She was 26 years old. And she was already planning to take my inheritance. 6 months into Jason and Nadia's marriage, the phone calls started. I'd hear Nadia on the phone late at night speaking in what I think was Russian. She thought I couldn't hear. But the walls in that house are thin, and I've spent 22 years learning to listen through them. She wasn't talking to Jason. She was talking to her parents, Victor and Irina. The conversations were long, intense. Sometimes she'd hang up and sit in the dark for 20 minutes before coming to bed. I started watching Nadia the way I'd watched Evelyn. The same patterns. The same calculation. But Nadia was faster, less careful. She made mistakes Evelyn never made. One afternoon, I came home early and found Nadia in my home office. She was going through my filing cabinet. She froze when she saw me. For half a second, pure panic crossed her face. Then she smiled and said, "I was looking for the warranty for the dishwasher. Evelyn said it might be in here." I said, "The dishwasher warranty is in the kitchen drawer where it's always been." She walked out. I checked the filing cabinet. The folder with my property deeds was moved. Not taken, moved. She'd photographed it. I could see the marks on the manila folder where she'd pressed it flat against the desk. I didn't say anything. Not to Evelyn. Not to Jason. I just moved the deeds to a safety deposit box the next day. Then the real pressure started. It began with comments at dinner. Nadia would say, "Victor and Irina's lease is up in 6 months. The landlord is raising the rent. It's terrible." She'd say this while looking at her plate. Casual. Repeated. Every week, the lease story would come up. Every week the details would shift. The landlord got worse. The neighborhood got dangerous. Victor's health got fragile. Then Jason started. He said, "Dad, have you thought about what you're going to do with the land upstate? It's just sitting there." I said, "I know what I'm going to do with it." He said, "What?" I said, "Keep it." He laughed, like I'd made a joke. I didn't laugh. Then Evelyn started. She said, "Marcus, Nadia's parents are getting older. They need stability. Your land has space. It would be a beautiful gesture." I said, "A gesture to who?" She said, "To family." I said, "They're not my family." Evelyn looked at me with those eyes. The eyes that had been trained by Margaret for 50 years. She said, "They are Jason's family, and Jason is your son. That's how this works." I said, "That's how you've made it work, not me." She left the room. I heard her on the phone to Margaret within minutes. Then Margaret called me directly. First time in 3 years she'd called me instead of going through Evelyn. She said, "Marcus, I hear you're being difficult about the property." I said, "I'm not being difficult, I'm saying no." She said, "No is a word for people who have options. You don't have options. You have a wife who tolerates you, a son who ignores you, and a piece of land that you're not using. Give Nadia's parents a place to live. Be useful for once." I said, "Margaret, my father gave me that land. It's the only thing he left me that your family hasn't touched." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Everything can be touched, Marcus, everything." I hung up. My hands were shaking. But not from fear this time. From anger. Real anger. The kind that had been building for 22 years in a locked room inside my chest. 2 weeks later, I came home and found Victor and Irina in my living room. They had suitcases. They had a cat in a carrier. Nadia was showing them around the house like it was a showroom. Jason was helping with bags. I stood in the doorway. Nobody saw me for 30 seconds. 30 seconds of watching these people settle into my house like they owned it. Then Irina saw me. She smiled and said something in Russian. Nadia translated. She said, "My mother says thank you for having them." I said, "Having them?" Nobody asked me. Nadia said, "Jason asked, he's your son. That's the same thing." I looked at Jason. He was avoiding my eyes. He was always avoiding my eyes. I said, "Jason, did you ask me if your in-laws could move into my house?" He said, "Dad, it's temporary, just until they find a place." I said, "How long is temporary?" Nadia said, "A few months, maybe longer. It depends on the market." I said, "Get them out." The room went silent. Victor looked at Irina. Irina looked at Nadia. Nadia looked at Jason. Jason finally looked at me. And what I saw in his face wasn't guilt. It was annoyance. Like I was the problem. Like I was being unreasonable in my own house. Nadia said, "Marcus, they have nowhere else to go. You have 40 acres, you have a farmhouse, you have this house, and you're here alone half the time anyway because Mom is always at Grandma's. What are you even protecting?" I said, "Myself." Nobody moved. I walked to the hall closet. I pulled out 3 suitcases that I had bought that morning. I set them on the floor. I said, "You have 10 minutes to pack. I'm calling a car to take you to a hotel. I'll pay for 1 week. After that you're on your own." Nadia's face changed. The smile disappeared. What was underneath it was ugly. She said, "You can't do this. Jason and I are married. What's mine is his and what's his is..." I said, "What's his is his. This house is mine. I bought it before I married Evelyn. My name, my deed, my mortgage that I paid off alone. You have no legal standing here." Nadia turned to Jason. She said, "Are you going to let him talk to me like this?" Jason looked at me. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He said, "Dad, please, just let them stay for a few days. We'll figure it out." I said, 10 minutes. Victor and Irina left. Nadia didn't speak to me for a month. Jason didn't speak to me for 2. Evelyn gave me a handwritten note that said, "You have made a powerful enemy." It was signed, Margaret. Evelyn had just delivered it. I should have felt victorious. I didn't. I felt alone. More alone than I'd ever felt. Because I'd finally stood up, and the only result was that everyone in my life now saw me as an obstacle. But something had changed in me. The list I'd been keeping for 22 years had turned into a plan. A real plan. Not revenge exactly. Something colder. Something more careful. I hired a lawyer. A man named Howard. Quiet. Expensive. Not from Margaret's world. I found him through a connection from my old job. A job Margaret had gotten me. The job I'd kept after Margaret because I'd been quietly building my own network for years. Howard listened to my story for 3 hours. He took notes. At the end he said, "You have a case. But it's not just about the property, is it?" I said, "No, it's about everything." Howard said, "Then we need to go further back than you think." He was right. Over the next 3 months, Howard and I unraveled things I hadn't known about. Things that restructured my entire understanding of my marriage. First, the job. The company where I'd worked for 15 years. Margaret hadn't got me that job as a favor. She'd placed me there. The owner of the company was Margaret's cousin. I was being monitored. Every promotion I got was approved by Margaret. Every salary increase was calculated to keep me just comfortable enough to not question anything. When I found a better job offer 8 years ago and told Evelyn I was considering it, she cried for 2 days. She said I was abandoning the family. She said Margaret would be devastated. I withdrew my application. That job would have doubled my salary. I know because I checked the salary range last month. 8 years of lost income. Calculated. Controlled. Second, the money. Evelyn hadn't just been moving money from our joint account. She'd been moving it into accounts in her mother's name. Over $260,000 over 15 years. Howard found the paper trail. It was buried in charitable donations and business expenses that were fabricated. Evelyn wasn't just stealing from me. She was laundering money through Margaret's network. Third, and this is the one that broke me, the life insurance policy. The one M had texted Evelyn about all those years ago. I found it. It was a $2 million policy on my life, taken out in year 3 of our marriage. The beneficiary was Evelyn. But there was a secondary beneficiary change filed 5 years ago. The secondary beneficiary was Nadia. They had a life insurance policy on me, and they'd added my daughter-in-law to it. I sat in Howard's office and stared at that document for 10 minutes. He said, "Marcus, are you okay?" I said, "No, but I'm ready." Now, I need to tell you what was happening with Claire during all of this. Because Claire's story and my story were about to collide in a way nobody expected. After Claire left Derek, she moved into a small apartment. She got a restraining order. Derek violated it twice. The second time, he showed up at her workplace and waited in the parking lot. She called the police. They took 45 minutes to arrive. Derek was gone by then, but he'd left a note on her windshield. It said, "You belong to me. Stop pretending otherwise." Claire called me that night. She said, "Marcus, I'm going to kill myself, not as a threat, as a statement. I can't live like this. He won't stop. The police won't help. Mom tells me to pray. I have nothing." I said, "Claire, listen to me. I'm coming to get you. You're moving in with me." She said, "Evelyn will never." I said, "Evelyn doesn't live in my house anymore. She moved into her mother's guest house 3 months ago. She just hasn't told anyone yet because she doesn't want to explain why." That was true. Evelyn had left. Not legally. Not formally. She'd just started spending more and more nights at Margaret's until she was basically living there. She still came to the house to maintain appearances. To check on me. To make sure I wasn't doing anything she didn't know about. But she was gone. And her absence had filled the house with a silence that I'd never heard before. A silence that felt like the first breath after nearly drowning. Claire moved in. She took the guest bedroom. The one Nadia had tried to claim for her parents. For 2 weeks Claire and I lived in that house like 2 refugees from the same war. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. We'd grown up in the same house, with the same parents who taught us the same lesson. Keep your head down. Don't make waves. Family is more important than your pain. But I was done with that lesson. Claire started going to therapy. A real therapist. Not the one Margaret had picked for Evelyn and me years ago, who spent every session asking me what I'd done to make Evelyn unhappy. Claire found her own therapist. A woman who specialized in domestic abuse. For the first time in her life, Claire was being told that none of it was her fault. And she started to change. Slowly. Painfully. But visibly. One night Claire came home from therapy and sat across from me at the kitchen table. She said, "My therapist asked me about our childhood, about Mom and Dad." I said, "What did you tell her?" Claire said, "I told her that Dad was gone, that Mom managed everything, that we were taught to be quiet and grateful." I said, "That's accurate." Claire said, "Is it?" Because my therapist said something that I can't stop thinking about. She said that being taught to be quiet and grateful is the same thing as being trained to be a victim. I didn't respond, but I felt it. That crack in the foundation getting wider. Now, here's where the story turns. Because while I was building my case against Evelyn and Margaret, something was happening inside Nadia's camp that I didn't see coming. Nadia went to Margaret.
Not to Evelyn, to Margaret.
She requested a private meeting. I know this because Margaret's housekeeper told my lawyer. The housekeeper had been with Margaret for 20 years, and she hated her. Everyone who worked for Margaret hated her. That was the one thing her money couldn't buy: loyalty. Nadia sat with Margaret and laid out her own plan. She told Margaret that Jason was weak, that he'd never run the family the way Margaret wanted, that Nadia should be the one to take control of the property portfolio. She proposed that Margaret help her push me out completely, not just from the house, from the land, from the family. She wanted it all.
Margaret listened.
Then she said, "You're not the first person to underestimate Jason. And you're not the first person to overestimate yourself." Nadia didn't like that. According to the housekeeper, Nadia left the meeting and sat in her car for 40 minutes. Then she made a phone call. To her parents. The conversation was in Russian. The housekeeper didn't understand the words, but she said Nadia's voice was different, not cold.
Desperate.
3 days later, Nadia showed up at my house.
Oh then.
No Jason.
No, Evelyn.
She knocked on the door like a normal person. I opened it. She looked different.
Smaller.
She said, "Can I come in?" I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I need to tell you something, and I can't tell anyone else."
I let her in.
We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Claire and I had sat in silence for weeks. Nadia poured herself water. Her hands were shaking. She said, "My parents aren't who you think they are." I said, "I don't think they're anyone. I don't know them." She said, "They owe money, a lot of money, to people in Brooklyn, bad people. They came to this country to escape debt and they've been running ever since. The apartment they said was too expensive. They were being evicted, not for rent, for debt collection." I said, "Why are you telling me this?" She said, "Because Margaret knows. Margaret found out 6 months ago. She's been using it against me. She said if I don't help her get the property, she'll turn my parents over to the people they owe. She'll make a phone call and my parents disappear."
I stared at her. Nadia.
The cold daughter-in-law. The one who photographed my deeds. The one who tried to move her parents onto my land. She was sitting at my table shaking because Margaret had her in a trap. I said, "So, the document you handed me in the driveway. The one asking me to let your parents build on my property. That was Margaret's idea." Nadia said, "Everything was Margaret's idea. My marriage to Jason, moving in, the phone calls. All of it. I'm not like Evelyn. I'm not built for this. I just wanted to survive." I leaned back. I said, "You expect me to feel sorry for you?" She said, "No. I expect you to understand. Because you've been in the same trap for 22 years. That hit me harder than I wanted it to. Because she was right. Nadia and I were both caught in Margaret's machine. We were both doing what we were told to survive. The only difference was that I'd been in the machine longer. I said, "What do you want from me?" She said, "Help me get out. Help me and Jason get away from her, please." I didn't answer her that night. I told her to go home. I told her to act normal. I told her I'd think about it. After she left, I sat in the dark for 2 hours. Then Claire came downstairs. She'd heard everything. She sat next to me and said, "She's telling the truth." I said, "How do you know?" Claire said, "Because I recognize the look, the shaking hands, the desperate eyes. That's what I looked like every time I tried to leave Derek. That's what a trapped woman looks like." I said, "She tried to take my land, Claire." Claire said, "Because Margaret told her to. Just like Derek told me to lie to the hospital. Just like Mom told you to make it work. We've all been someone's soldier, Marcus. None of us chose this war." That night, I couldn't sleep. I went to my filing cabinet. The real one. The one in the basement that Evelyn didn't know about. I pulled out everything Howard had given me. The financial records. The insurance policy. The job history. And I added something new. A theory. A terrible theory that had been forming in the back of my mind since Nadia sat at my table and broke down. If Margaret had been controlling my marriage from the beginning. If she had placed me at that company. If she had guided Evelyn through every decision. If she had trapped Nadia the same way. Then Margaret wasn't just a mother-in-law. She was an architect. And I needed to know why. I called Howard. It was midnight. He answered. I said, I need you to find something. Margaret's first husband, Evelyn's father. I've never met him. I've never seen a photo. He's never been discussed. Not once in 22 years. Find out what happened to him. Howard was quiet. Then he said, I've been wondering when you'd ask about that. I said, what do you know? He said, I already looked into it, as a precaution. I didn't want to tell you until I was sure. His name was Robert. He and Margaret were married. For 12 years, he disappeared in 1997. There was a police report. Margaret told the police he left her for another woman. The case went cold. I said, and? Howard said, and last week I found a death certificate. Robert didn't disappear. He died. In 1997. In a different state. The death certificate lists the cause as accidental drowning, but the coroner's report noted bruising on the chest and arms that was inconsistent with a drowning. I didn't speak for a long time. Howard said, Marcus, I think Margaret killed her first husband. I said, I think you're right. He said, what do you want to do? I said, what I should have done 22 years ago, stop being afraid. The next 4 weeks were the most intense of my life. Howard worked with a retired police detective named Kowalski, a woman, tough, no patience for rich people games. She took the Robert file and started pulling threads. Meanwhile, I continued playing the weak husband. I went to Margaret's dinners. I smiled.
He nodded.
I let Evelyn make her comments. I let Jason avoid my eyes. I let Nadia pretend nothing had changed. But behind the scenes, everything was moving. Claire was the one who made the first real move. She went to the police about Derek. Not just the restraining order violations. Everything. 20 years of abuse. Documented. Photographed. She had kept a journal since 2015. Every incident, every bruise, every lie she told to cover for him. She handed it all to a detective. Derek was arrested on a Tuesday afternoon at his workplace. Handcuffed in front of his coworkers. Claire watched from across the street. She called me and said, he looked small. I always thought he was so big, but in handcuffs he looked small. Derek was charged with 17 counts.
Then.
The DA took the case personally. Claire finally had someone fighting for her. And watching her go through that process gave me something I'd never had before.
Courage.
Real courage. Not the absence of fear, but the decision that something mattered more than fear. Now, I need to tell you about the night everything exploded. Margaret hosted her annual charity gala. 200 people. A hotel ballroom.
Evelyn was there.
Jason was there. Nadia was there in a dress that probably cost more than Claire's car. I was there in a suit that I'd owned for 6 years. Margaret noticed. She always noticed. At dinner, Margaret stood and gave her speech. About charity, about family, about legacy. Then she said something that changed everything. She said, I'm also pleased to announce that this family will be expanding its footprint. We'll be developing the upstate property that has been in Marcus's family. It will become a retreat center bearing our family name. Marcus has generously agreed to this. 200 people looked at me and applauded. I hadn't agreed to anything. I was sitting at a table being told that my father's land was being taken from me in front of an audience. I didn't applaud. I didn't stand. I sat there while 200 people clapped for the theft of my inheritance. Evelyn kicked me under the table. She whispered, stand up, smile. We'll discuss it later. I stood up. I smiled. I sat back down. But inside, something snapped. Not dramatically, quietly. The way a lock breaks when you turn the key one too many times. After the gala, I went home. Claire was there. She could see it on my face. She said, what happened? I told her. She said, what are you going to do? I said, tomorrow. Everything happens tomorrow. Tomorrow was a Thursday. Thursday morning, I met Howard at his office.
Kowalski was there.
She had a file thick enough to stop a door. She said, we have enough to reopen Robert's case. The detective who originally handled it is dead, but his notes are garbage. We found witnesses. A woman who worked at a motel near the lake where Robert supposedly drowned. She remembers seeing Margaret check in alone 2 days before the body was found. She remembers Margaret checking out the morning the body was discovered. She never saw a man. I said, "Can you arrest her?" Kowalski said, "Not yet, but we can bring her in for questioning, and during questioning we can present what we have. Sometimes the act of being questioned is enough to crack someone, especially someone who's been hiding something for 25 years. I said, "Do it." That afternoon, I also filed for divorce from Evelyn. Howard had prepared everything. The filing included evidence of the stolen money, the fraudulent accounts, the life insurance policy, the burner phone records, everything. Evelyn was served at Margaret's house at 4:30 in the afternoon. By 6 o'clock, Margaret knew. By 7 o'clock, my phone was ringing. It was Jason.
Not Evelyn, not Margaret.
Jason. He said, "Dad, what are you doing?" I said, "What I should have done before you were born." He said, "You're tearing this family apart." I said, "There is no family, Jason. There's a corporation, and you and I are just employees." He was quiet. Then he said, "Mom is destroyed." I said, "Your mother is a thief. She's been stealing from me for 15 years. She has a life insurance policy on me with Nadia as the secondary beneficiary. Read the filing, Jason. Read all of it."
He hung up.
Friday morning, Margaret was brought in for questioning. Kowalski called me from the precinct. She said, "She's calm, too calm." She brought a lawyer, of course she did. We presented the motel witness statement. She denied being at the motel. We showed a credit card receipt with her name on it from that motel on the date in question. Her lawyer asked for a break. 2 hours into the break, Margaret's lawyer called Kowalski and said Margaret wanted to make a statement. Not through her lawyer.
In person.
On the record. Kowalski called me again. She said, "This is unusual. I don't know what she's going to say. Do you want to come listen?" I said, "Yes." I was in the observation room when Margaret walked back into the interrogation room. She sat down. She looked at the mirror. She knew I was behind it. She said, "Marcus, I know you're there." Kowalski said, "Mrs. Harrington, you requested to make a statement." Margaret straightened her jacket. She looked directly at the mirror.
At me.
And she said, "Robert didn't drown. I didn't kill him either. Robert is alive. He's been alive for 25 years. He's living in Oregon under a different name. I helped him disappear because he was going to go to prison for embezzlement, and he would have taken the entire family down. With him. I faked his death to protect Evelyn. To protect this family. Everything I've done, every decision I've made about Marcus, about Jason, about Nadia, about the money, about the property, all of it was to protect this family from being destroyed the way Robert almost destroyed it." Kowalski said, "If Robert is alive, we can verify that." Margaret said, "I know. That's why I'm telling you, because I'm tired. I'm 73 years old, and I've been carrying this for 25 years, and I've been carrying Evelyn, and I've been carrying this family, and nobody has ever once asked me what it cost me." She looked at the mirror again. She said, "Marcus, you think I'm the villain. You think I destroyed your marriage. I didn't destroy anything. I managed everything. I managed it because nobody else was going to. Your father-in-law was a criminal. My daughter was fragile. My grandson needed structure. And you were going to float through life, letting everyone down, just like your father let you down. I gave you a job. I gave you a wife. I gave you a son. I gave you a life. And your response is to hire a lawyer and try to destroy me." She stopped. She took a breath. Then she said something that I will never forget as long as I live. She said, "I wasn't trying to take your land, Marcus. I was trying to make sure you didn't lose it the way Robert lost everything. The development deal was real. It would have tripled the value. You would have been wealthy. Your son would have been set. But you couldn't see that because you've spent 22 years deciding that I'm the enemy instead of seeing that I'm the only person who ever protected you from yourself." Kowalski stopped the recording. She looked at me through the glass. I was sitting with my hands pressed together, shaking, not from anger, from something worse. The horrible creeping feeling that Margaret might be telling the truth. Not all of it, but enough of it. They verified Robert was alive. He was in Oregon, running a hardware store. He confirmed Margaret's story about the embezzlement. He confirmed she helped him disappear. He said, "Margaret didn't kill me. Margaret saved me from myself, And then she spent the next 25 years making sure nobody ever found out what a coward I was. The case was closed. No charges. Margaret walked out of that precinct and got into her car and drove home. And I sat in the parking lot for an hour. Because here's what I couldn't stop thinking about. If Margaret was telling the truth about Robert, then everything I thought I knew was wrong. Not completely wrong, but wrong enough. She wasn't a murderer.
She was a controller, a manipulator.
A woman who took one crisis and used it as a license to run everyone's life forever. She'd saved her husband from prison, and then used that secret as justification for becoming a dictator.
And I had let her.
For 22 years I had let her. But I was also a victim of my own family. My father, who never fought for anything. My mother, who chose appearances over truth. The family that taught me silence was strength. Evelyn and I met at a restaurant 2 weeks after the divorce filing. Just the two of us. No lawyers.
No Margaret.
We sat across from each other, like strangers. She looked older. Tired. She said, "I don't know how to be married without my mother running it." I said, "Neither do I." She said, "I took your money, I know that. I knew it the whole time I was doing it. She told me to, and I did it because when my mother tells you to do something, you do it. That's how I was raised, that's all I know." I said, "Evelyn, do you love me? Did you ever love me?" She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know what love is. My mother told me who to marry. She told me when to have a child. She told me how to manage you. I've never made a single decision in my life that wasn't approved by her. So no. I don't know if I love you. I don't know what love feels like when it's not someone else's idea." That was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. And it was the saddest. The divorce went through. Evelyn got a settlement. Not what she wanted. Not what Margaret wanted.
But fair.
Howard made sure of that. The stolen money was returned. The insurance policy was canceled. The fraudulent accounts were closed. Jason called me the day the divorce was finalized. He said, "Dad, I need to talk to you." I said, "Come over." He came over with Nadia. They sat on my couch. Claire was in the kitchen. She could hear everything. Jason said, "Nadia told me everything, about Margaret, about the debt her parents owe, about how Margaret was using her, about how Margaret used all of us." I said, "What do you want to do?" He said, "I want out. Nadia and I want to leave, move somewhere else, start over. But we don't have any money because Mom took it all and Grandma controlled the rest, and I've never had a job that wasn't connected to the family." I looked at Nadia. She was crying. Real tears. Not Evelyn's performance tears. Real exhaustion. Real fear. Real relief that it was finally over. I said, "I have the land, the 40 acres, I'm keeping it. But I'll subdivide it. I'll give you 2 acres, you build a house, you start over. And Margaret never touches you again." Jason looked at me. For the first time since he was a child, he looked at me directly. He said, "Why would you do that, after everything we did to you?" I said, "Because you're my son. And my father taught me one thing that Margaret never could. Family doesn't mean control, it means showing up when everyone else leaves." Claire came out of the kitchen. She sat next to me. She said, "That's the most dad thing you've ever said." Jason started crying. Nadia started crying. I didn't cry. I'd done my crying in cars and driveways and dark hallways for 22 years. I was empty now. But it was a clean empty. Like a room that's been cleared of everything rotten so it can finally breathe. Now, here's the final part. The part I saved for last. The part that still doesn't feel real when I say it out loud. 3 days after Jason and Nadia moved onto the land, I got a letter. Not from Margaret. Not from Evelyn. From Robert,
Evelyn's father.
the man who supposedly drowned 25 years ago. The letter was 6 pages long. Handwritten.
Shaky.
He wrote about Oregon. About the hardware store. About the guilt that lived in his chest like a second heart. He wrote about watching Evelyn from afar. About seeing photos of Jason online. About knowing he had a grandson he'd never met. Then he wrote this. And I'm going to read it exactly as he wrote it. "Marcus, I know what Margaret did to you. I know because she did the same thing to me. Not the money part, the control part, the making you feel small part, the rewriting your life part. Margaret is not evil. Margaret is broken. She broke me, and then she broke everyone around me to make sure nobody could see the cracks. I ran instead of fighting. That was my cowardice. You stayed. That was your courage. Even when you were silent, you were still there. Still breathing. Still surviving. Don't let my daughter spend her whole life being Margaret's shadow, the way I spent mine being Margaret's secret. She deserves to know the truth. She deserves to choose who she is without her mother's hand on her neck. He included a phone number, an Oregon area code. I drove to Evelyn's apartment. She was living in a small place, no furniture from the house. Just a bed and a table and a lamp. Margaret had cut her off completely when the divorce happened. Margaret's version of love was conditional on compliance. Evelyn had stopped complying, so Margaret discarded her. Evelyn opened the door and saw me standing there with the letter. She said, "What is that?" I handed it to her. She read it standing in the doorway. I watched her face go through something I'd never seen before. Confusion, recognition, pain, then a collapse. Not physical, emotional. She sank to the floor in the doorway of her empty apartment, holding a letter from a dead man who wasn't dead, and she made a sound that I can only describe as the sound a person makes when they realize their entire life was built on someone else's lie. She looked up at me from the floor and said, "My father is alive." I said, "Yes." She said, "She told me he left us. She told me he chose another woman. She told me I wasn't enough to make him stay." I said, "He didn't leave. He ran. There's a difference." Evelyn sat on that floor for a long time. Then she said, "I called my mother a few days ago. I called to tell her I missed her." She said, "You made your choice, live with it," and hung up. I said, "That's what she does. When you stop being useful, she erases you." Evelyn looked at me, and for the first time in 22 years, I saw something in her eyes that I'd never seen. Not love. Not warmth, something more important. Awareness. She saw herself clearly, for the first time. She saw what she'd been, what she'd done, what she'd allowed. She said, "Marcus, I'm sorry." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you think I can call him, Robert? Do you think he'll talk to me?" I said, "He wrote you a 6-page letter. He wants to talk to you more than you can imagine." Evelyn called her father that night. I drove home. Claire was on the porch. She asked, "How did it go?" I said, "She's calling her father, a man she thought was dead for 25 years. Claire said, "What happens now?" I said, "I don't know. For the first time in my life, I don't have a plan." Claire smiled. She said, "Good. Plans are what got us into this mess." I sat on that porch and looked at the land. My land. My father's land. His father's land. Somewhere on that land, Jason and Nadia were building a house. A real house, not a Margaret production. A house with mistakes in it. Uneven nails. Crooked shelves. A house built by people who were free. The 40 acres that Margaret tried to take. The 40 acres that Nadia tried to give away. The 40 acres that I almost lost to a development deal that was never about helping me. They're still mine, not because I fought harder, but because I finally stopped fighting the wrong people. My son is on my land. My sister is in my house. My ex-wife is talking to her dead father on the phone. Margaret is alone in her mansion with no one left to control. And I'm sitting on a porch that my father built with his own hands before Margaret ever heard my name. I'm not happy. Happiness isn't the right word. I'm something else. I'm unburdened. I'm uncontrolled. I'm the man I was supposed to be before everyone decided who I should be. If you're watching this, and you're in a situation where someone is making your decisions, where someone is rewriting your life, where someone is making you feel small on purpose, listen to me. The list you're keeping in your head, the one with all the lies and manipulations and moments you bit your tongue until it bled. That list is not a diary. It's evidence, not for a courtroom, for you. Evidence that you've been awake the whole time, that you saw everything, that you were never as weak as they wanted you to believe. The day Nadia handed me that document in the driveway, I could have signed it. I could have given away the last piece of my father. I could have kept being the quiet man in the corner at Margaret's galas applauding for the theft of his own life. Instead, I said 2 words. Get out. 2 words. 22 years of silence, and it came down to 2 words.
Don't wait as long as I did.
Say them now. Say them loud. Say them to whoever is standing in your driveway, thinking they have the right to take what's yours. Get out. It works. I promise you. It works.